Well, good morning. I just came out of a fascinating and terrifying hearing in the Intelligence Committee, a rare open hearing of the Intelligence Committee on the subject of deep fakes. And it made me realize that as big a problem as we have with ideology, our biggest problem in the future will be epistemology. You know, how do we know what we know? It's not about whether we disagree about a common set of facts, it's whether we know what's true and what's not. And it is exactly that same issue that lies at the heart of the legislation we're here to reintroduce. The LGBTQ Essential Data Act is fundamentally about making sure we know what the truth is about violence against members of our community. It was just almost exactly 3 years ago today that we were all mourning the loss of dozens of young people from our community following the Pulse nightclub shooting. And with your indulgence, I'd like to begin by asking you to join me in a moment of silence for those victims and for all victims of hate. Thank you. Well, so it's pretty simple. We can not ever understand the epidemic of LGBTQ violence that we've all heard about from so many of our friends and colleagues and so many members of our community if we don't have accurate information on it. Victims of violence targeted at in the LGBT community are often invisible to the rest of the world just because of who they are, who they love. The experts here agree we need quality data showing where, how, why, to whom this violence is happening so we can get in action to save LGBTQ lives. Today I'm proud to join my colleagues, Representatives Chris Pappas from New Hampshire, Donna Shalala of Florida, Joe Kennedy of Massachusetts, along with JODEE WINTERHOF from the Human Rights Campaign, Diego Sanchez from PFLAG, Sam Britton from the Trevor Project, in introducing the LGBTQ Essential Data Act. The bill will strengthen the Center for Disease Control's National Violent Death Reporting System by improving data collection regarding sexual orientation and gender identity in violent deaths. There are still barriers we face when collecting data on sexual orientation and gender identity. At the time of the Pulse nightclub massacre, Florida didn't utilize the National Violence Death Reporting System. That means the lives we lost that night in Orlando were never recorded as anti-LGBT murders in any data collection. Just think about that. The bill will authorize $25 million to fully fund the NVDRS, the National Violent Data Reporting System, and help the states facing a backlog of data collection to get up to speed. My colleagues can speak with more specificity on the need for this data collection, on what's happening now at the states, or more accurately is not happening at the states. And so I really want to thank them and for all of you for your interest in this legislation. Thank my colleagues at the Human Rights Campaign, at PFLAG. We've stood at this podium many times about many issues. This is only one piece of the ongoing problems that our communities face in this time of ever more heated language and the attacks on our community. And we'll keep working at it. But it is the work that these folks do behind me every day that really is critical to saving LGBTQ lives. So I'd like to introduce my colleague from the Granite State, Representative Chris Pappas.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for being here this morning. Thank you to my colleague, Congressman Maloney, for introducing this essential piece of legislation. And I want to especially give thanks to all the members of the Equality Caucus who are here with us today, as well as our allies and allied groups. It's really important that we push this legislation forward to protect lives and understand the hate that still exists in our country, to be able to measure it and to be able to effectively rise up against it. We gather here today in memory of the 49 lives lost in a senseless act of violence that has left the city of Orlando, the LGBTQ community, and our nation forever changed. LGBTQ Americans and allies gathered across our country to celebrate Pride this month, to mark the progress that we have made. But those at the Pulse nightclub 3 years ago were met with unimaginable violence during this period. And think of it, they gathered in a place where they could be their authentic selves. And for many of them, they had to hide who they were. But in a nightclub like that, they could be themselves and live their truths, and that's where they were gunned down and where their lives were cut short. It's really horrific. The mass shooting carried out that night by a lone gunman took lives full of promise and left behind indescribable sadness, anguish, and despair. And although attacks on the LGBT community are certainly not new and are unfortunately on the rise, for so many LGBTQ Americans, the Pulse nightclub shooting served as a sobering reminder of just how far we have to go as a nation. While the lives and legacies of these innocent Americans are seared in our collective memory, it's not enough to honor their lives with words. It is time to take action, and that's what this legislation will allow us to do. I'm proud to stand here today with my colleagues to introduce this legislation that will enable us to make forward progress toward fulfilling the most fundamental promise we can make to the American people, that we as members of Congress will do everything in our power to keep people safe. The LGBTQ Essential Data Act will help address the epidemic of violence against our community by ensuring that our government is capturing and reporting the information we need to better understand the threat that we face and the scope of the problem and how to stop it. The legislation will assist us in directing law enforcement resources to protect LGBTQ Americans with the goal of enabling them to live lives of purpose, with dignity and without fear or without insecurity. It's time to live up to our nation's promise for each and every individual among us. And we need to allow each and every individual to be able to live their truth open and honestly, regardless of their race, their gender, their religion, or their sexual orientation. Let's pass this act now. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague from Florida, Congresswoman Shalala.
Good job, Chris.
Nice job, Chris. Thank you very much. I join my colleagues in supporting this legislation. There is nothing better than for us to accumulate evidence and to make decisions based on that evidence. But more importantly, we need to chronicle this information for everyone in our country. Violence against the LGBTQ community continues to rear its ugly, homophobic head. 3 years ago and 1 day ago, we saw in Orlando, in my state, when a gunman opened fire at the Pulse nightclub. He killed 49 people. I remember that summer day when we woke up to discover a specter of hate had infiltrated the queer community. I remember how a tragedy so close to home became a story with national implications. I remember that we were still reeling from anger and sorrow because these were our people. One of the victims, Jerry Wright, who was a Miami Heat fan who loved to dance. Today, Jerry's parents, who are my friends, Fred and Maria, lead the local Moms Demand Action in my district. It has been 3 years, and our Florida community is still stitching itself back together. Even with the support of neighbors and the sympathy of our nation, we feel the holes left by those who were stolen from us. These were our people. We will remember them with pride, and we will honor them with action. Thank you. And now let me introduce our colleague Joe Kennedy from Massachusetts, who is a member of the LGBTQ caucus.
Good morning, everybody. To my colleague from New York, Mr. Maloney, to my colleagues that are here, Sean, your leadership on issues on civil rights, and particularly the LGBT community, is unparalleled in Congress. And the impetus to refile this legislation today, I don't think could not be any more important. Our country is founded on the basic idea that everybody counts, and everybody is worthy, everybody deserves protection. And our country's story is actually the struggle to make good on that promise. It is a reckoning with the fact that we have time and time again over our history fallen short of that commitment we have made to our people. But if we're going to improve on it, if we're going to make progress towards that goal, it's going to have to come with an honest reckoning of the times where we have fallen short. Discrimination that still persists in our country, that those words etched in stone, the doors of the Supreme Court across the street, still do not ring true because we do not have, in fact, equal protection and equal justice under law. What this law is about, what this bill is about today, is about making sure we can do a full accounting. That when our country falls short because of hate, when people are targeted because of who they are, that we recognize it, that we are forced to confront it, and that by that confrontation, we must do better. A commitment that we know every single citizen in this country, every single person in our nation, and that we will continue to make progress and continue to struggle, to scratch and scrape and claw our way forward. To know that we have to do this today, 3 years and a day after a horrendous massacre. People targeted because of who they are. Because our country still, even with their passing, couldn't find a way to reconcile those statistics to ring true. This legislation seeks to elevate their memory and continue to move forward in a promise that we make to every single person here. You count, you're worthy. Your government sees you, hears you, and will protect you. With that, I'm honored to introduce our colleague from New York, Carolyn Maloney.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm Congresswoman Maloney from New York, and I'm a member of the Maloney Caucus with John Patrick Maloney, and I support all of his work. And this is a particularly important piece of legislation, and I thank all of my colleagues that have joined him in supporting it. Yesterday was the 3rd anniversary of the Pulse nightclub shooting, and 3 years ago, 49 young people were seriously murdered and 53 more were wounded. A horrific crime, and the fact that it did not make it into the national database of tracking crimes shows how important this designation of LGBTQ added to that database is. And I congratulate him for speaking out. I'm going to put my comments in the record because it's raining, and I think it's important that we hear from the people who do the hard work every day, the advocates, and I'd like to introduce JODEE WINTERHOF, Senior Vice President for Policy and Political Affairs for the Human Rights Campaign that has been a force in moving forward these issues in Congress and around our country.
Thank you, Carolyn. Hey, I'm going to suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that I don't think this is going to stop, so I know you got some equipment. Do you want to just quickly reset? We'll stand maybe right under this edge, and you guys just gather on either side. Is that all right?
Good morning. My name's JODEE WINTERHOF. I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy and Political Affairs at the Human Rights Campaign, the largest civil rights LGBTQ organization in the country. I'd like to begin by thanking Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney for not just his leadership on this particular legislation, but for his extensive leadership for our community, his blazing trails as a co-chair of the LGBTQ Caucus here in Congress, and as a friend to the community who's with us every day in this battle, and the other members of Congress with us today. Yesterday we marked 3 years since the Pulse tragedy, and mostly LGBTQ and Latinx young people were killed. It was such a hard time for the community and for the families. It continues to be a hard time for the community and the families as we continue to heal. And today we add this to the list of ways we're honoring them with our actions. While we remember them today and every day, we also come together this morning to honor their memories with these actions. The violence that targets the LGBTQ community is not limited to a single instance or an individual place. Violence against LGBTQ people, whether motivated or influenced by hate, is an ongoing epidemic that requires our urgent action. Over the last 5 years, more than 130 transgender people, mostly transgender women of color, have been killed. Last year, the FBI reported an increase in anti-LGBTQ hate crimes, and as Pride Month began, our community was left reeling by the tragic news of the murder of 3 LGBTQ people in Michigan and a spree of anti-transgender violence in Dallas and Texas. While we know this epidemic of violence is a national crisis, the holes in our national data collection effort and leaves policymakers, leaders, and advocates with an incomplete picture of the full scope of this violence. Passage of the LGBTQ Essential Data Act would be a critical step in our ongoing effort to end this violence and build a safer community for all people. By strengthening the National Violent Data Reporting System and improving data collection regarding sexual orientation and gender identity and violent deaths, we will gain a deeper understanding of the causes, circumstances, and factors that lead to violence against the LGBTQ community. This information will be life-saving, enhancing our nation's ability to craft solutions to both prevent violence and serve survivors. We stand in solidarity today with organizations like PFLAG and the Trevor Project and these members of Congress. Too often, violence against the LGBTQ community goes unreported, uninvestigated, and unaddressed. That must end, and end now. This legislation makes clear that every act of violence matters and that every victim of violence should be counted. To every family member mourning the loss of the death of an LGBTQ loved one, we see you, we mourn with you, and we will never forget your loss. It's time our government steps up and does the same. Thank you. I would like to now turn it over to Diego Sanchez with PFLAG.
Thank you, JODEE. My name's Diego Sanchez. I'm the Director of Advocacy, Policy, and Partnerships for PFLAG National. I'd like to thank so much the members of Congress. Sean Patrick Maloney, thank you so much. And I need to also point out that Congressman Joe Kennedy not only is a vice chair of the LGBT Equality Caucus, but also the chair of the Transgender Working Group. I, as an openly trans Latino man, Latinx man, think every day when I get home and turn the key to go in my house that I live through another day, literally. I am personally a victim of violence many times over. My face looks better not in pulp, I will say, but it has been there. And Rita Hester from Massachusetts, for whom the Transgender Day of Remembrance was named, her death, honoring her death, remembering her, and now thousands every year, was my friend. And Sylvia Vera at Stonewall, as we celebrate, honor 50 years after the raucous riot, was my friend. I live and they don't. But all three of us and everyone else, we matter. Our lives matter. And I come from a corporate background where the line is, you can't manage what you can't measure. So if the CDC will not count our bodies, how do they know how many we lose or how many we save? We all deserve to be counted. I will tell you that I was deployed by the Department of Justice, the Community Relations Service, the day after Pulse. I was deployed to Orlando. PFLAG couldn't afford to put me there, but Marriott gave me a room for 3 weeks where I stayed and worked with the families because PFLAG is that family organization. I will tell you those 49 we lost and the 53 who survived. The most important part, other than the loss itself, was the loss by those who were living. Many of those parents did not know that their children were LGBTQ, and they were left with the question of not, oh my God, they're gay, or they're trans, or they're bi, or they're lesbian, or they're queer questioning, but why didn't they trust me enough to tell me? And our job was to explain that they were trying to keep you safe, because while all those people were in Orlando at Pulse, most of them lived in Kissimmee. And I will tell you that if you go to Kissimmee, it's wonderful because we have Disney and that's delightful. But if you live there and you're LGBTQ and you're Latinx, it's dangerous sometimes because there's not enough love to spread around equally for everyone. We worked with those families to help them understand that the children they lost loved them and they were trying to be very brave to protect them. This data collection will make the difference in the people who can feel comfortable because they know that when violence is reported, it is viewed. We will not be erased. And I would now like to introduce my absolute delightful friend and colleague, Sam Brinton from the Trevor Project.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. 3 years ago, I was in the happiest place in the world. I was dancing with my friends, Drew and Juan, and we were laughing up a storm. A week later, I would be collapsing in tears as I learned that Drew and Juan had died in each other's arms at the shooting at Pulse. A little more than a year later, I joined the Trevor Project as our head of advocacy and government affairs, As the world's largest crisis intervention and suicide prevention organization for LGBTQ youth, we are well acquitted with grief and seek to be there for those who are in crisis. It was then that I realized that Drew and Juan may never be counted in national statistics that we advocates use so often to prevent future deaths. They would, in a way, be erased after their death. The National Violent Death Reporting System is a critical system for the data on violent deaths like homicide and suicide. And it does have variables on sexual orientation and gender identity, but unfortunately, this data is rarely collected. The Trevor Project surveyed all NVDRS sites in the summer of 2018. We requested the data collected in the sexual orientation and transgender variables. Sadly, 1 in 3 states reported a single LGBT death since the start of collection in 2013, and only 5 states reported more than 50 LGBT deaths, which seems closer to the estimated average. Although this research seems depressing, we did learn something. Training was the key to better data. Medical examiners wanted to get this data, but they didn't know how. That's where the LGBTQ Essential Data Act comes in. By not only encouraging improvement in the NVDRS, but also providing funding for this improvement, the LGBTQ Essential Data Act will begin to raise the voices of those we've lost by counting their true identities. Yesterday, the Trevor Project released our survey results. Yes, we really like data. And found that almost 4 in 10 LGBTQ youth have seriously considered suicide this year alone. Almost 4 in 10. We will never really know how many youth die by suicide, since without the LGBTQ Essential Data Act and its improvements to NVDRS, the sexual orientation and gender identity of LGBTQ youth, suicide is not counted. Let's honor Drew and Juan, the victims of Pulse, and the LGBTQ youth listening to us right now to pass this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Everybody ready? All right, I want to thank everyone for being here. Happy to take a couple of questions. You know, it was just a week ago that we passed the Equality Act, or maybe a little more now, and only 8 Republicans joined us in that effort. You don't see any Republicans here today, unfortunately, but bear in mind what we're asking from our colleagues now is to be counted when we're killed violently. And I wonder whether that's also too much to ask when it comes to bipartisan support. So we are going to be putting this question to our colleagues. We need your help. Nothing about the last 25 years makes any of us discouraged about what's possible in this country. The system has worked for us when we have worked together with our allies and with all of you. And we are the least cynical people in American politics, because we know if we keep working, this system will work for all of us, and we are going to win together in this area and all the others. But we got to keep working during Pride Month and every other day of the year. So thank you for your interest. And if there are any questions, happy to take them, or we can work with you individually.